Welcome back to Conversations for the Good. Good afternoon, Dr. Jane.
Good afternoon, Anna. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Our last conversation, we focused on how we cope with gratitude.
Mm.
People love finding the positive in life, and that has been becoming increasingly difficult in this time of sheltering, social distancing, and the ongoing crisis of the virus.
You know what? And Anna, we're a feel good culture. I mean, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, our current situation has presented a major challenge to this feel good line of thinking. So much of what we're encountering is really out of our control. So let's tap into our willingness to explore another option for coping: acceptance.
Oh, yes, acceptance. Well, that always presents a full spectrum of thoughts and sometimes getting complex.
Well, yeah, we can make it pretty complex, that's for sure. But let's look at that because we've talked in the past in previous episodes about the ABCs of thinking and the backstory, and this is what really creates our worldview, my perception of myself and the world and myself in the world. And this is kind of the identity. And we also view through this backstory and this interpretation, we identify things in two different categories: good and bad, right or wrong. Um, and so often, what this does is it creates this mix of really wanting to move toward all that we find good, all that we find right, and these were the conditioning, the training that came from our formative years, our childhood, our families, our churches, our schools, friendships. All our beliefs and all our values kind of play into this, being able to see things in one of two ways. It's part of our socialization and provides the frames through which we view and interpret life and also how we live life.
Yes, and our personal experiences provide the lens to the glasses, the analogy that you used before.
That's right. That's right. So the things we observe in the world so often that fall outside of our comfort and our preferred reality are often framed, judged as wrong, bad, incorrect. And being in situations like that really cultivate and generate discomfort and difficulty. And we tend to criticize them. We tend to judge them as being wrong. So, in the long run, we're really learning to judge and criticize or approve, depending on our comfort level. And very often, if things are uncomfortable, we look to improve them or change them because they don't align with our beliefs and values, right? And sometimes this is doable, and sometimes it isn't. And if we're unable to affect change, we run into sometimes a position of either needing to remove ourselves from the situation or go along with the situation. Okay. So sometimes it's that either or. Sometimes we can't get out of that situation that's causing us discomfort, like the crisis that we're in currently. Obviously, this is an oversimplification of how we live in discomfort and how we try to move out of discomfort, but it represents how many of us conceptualize acceptance, kind of putting up with something that I don't like, or approving and liking and kind of moving toward things that I do like. So sometimes it's doable option to remove ourselves, but sometimes we're just in it. We're just we're just in it and we can't maneuver ourselves out of it. But what happens is it's not just the situation, it's that I'm stewing in my discontentment. I'm stewing on the inside. So it keeps that reactivity alive and fed, very often well fed.
Yes. So the situation that causes discomfort and difficulty to change it. So we need to put up with it or get out.
Well, very often it seems like an either or. Our automatic responses to being in discomfort are things like, I can't stand this. This drives me crazy. This isn't right. They shouldn't do this to me. Or we kind of move into that whatever. But in all of this, we're staying in our disapproval and internally or externally, sometimes both, fussing and fuming because something isn't right and it feels like there's nothing we can do about it. Or very often we just kind of invest time and energy in worrying about it, angsting about it, replaying the wrongness of it. Um, what we'd like to say or do if I could get in there and, and duke it out. And this becomes part of our personal stories. We're fueling this reactivity, and pretty soon it has a life of its own. And this is familiar to all of us. I know it is for me. The bottom line is it's not the situation that's causing me to stew and fume and fuss, is my interpretation,
Mhm.
my ongoing investment in being right, and my refusal and my unwillingness to be with what's happening now just as it is.
Oh, yes, I feel the heat of my experiences with this. It's like the only way that I will let myself feel better is for the person or the situation to change.
Yeah, and sometimes Anna, we really put an effort into looking for the positives, or to think more positively about the situation. It's called reframing. Actually, it's called cognitive reframing. Where we're trying to change the story we're telling ourselves about a person or a situation. And in doing this, it sometimes works. Sometimes we're able to shift the gears and shift the story. This is the cornerstone of what's known as cognitive therapy, where you change your thinking, you change your feelings, and you'll feel better. You'll feel okay. You'll be able to move through a struggle.
Yeah, not that simple though, huh?
Well, sometimes, yes, sometimes it can work beautifully, but sometimes sidestepping the possibility um, of really being with our emotions just as they are occurring. Sometimes we want to sidestep that by being, moving to the positive. And very often our emotions need to be recognized. They need to be given permission to kind of move and move us in a healing direction. So this is acceptance. This is acceptance. Being in what is here and now, just as it is, the willingness to see the person or situation just as they are. And in doing this, it's a willful act, it's a conscious choice, and it can lead to a great deal of happiness in the long run. It's when we stop identifying with the struggle, and in doing so, we're no longer defined by the struggle. But remember, the struggles that consume us are not the situation of the person. It's my interpretation and the ensuing emotions and stories that are creative out of that. So, in our openness to acknowledge things just as they are, we strengthen our ability to really tolerate distress. And our capacity to change our inner story comes along with that, which transforms the reality very often of what we're creating through our reactivity. We can't change the past, but we can change the future by the choices we make today. And as I said, acceptance is a process and it's a practice activated by willingness and conscious choice. The how to is simple, but it certainly isn't necessarily easy.
Mhm. Well, this makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's dive in.
Well, we introduced this really in a previous conversation. It was called Turning Toward the Discomfort. And we introduced the practice of observing uncomfortable thoughts and feelings as they arise with kindness and compassion, rather than avoiding or denying or medicating our discomfort and struggle. We've also talked about the gap between this is where I am and this is where I should, operative word is should be, and how this causes a great deal of misery and suffering. So acceptance comes from the Latin root, which means to find rest in. And the key here is writing out the unpleasant experiences by resting in what's occurring, what's actually occurring in the moment.
Well, this is certainly timely.
Well, yeah, and the concept of and practice of acceptance is often misunderstood, because this is very active process. There's nothing passive about it. We're not being resigned to a situation. It's also not about condoning a situation or condoning another's choice or allowing somebody to mistreat us. It doesn't mean we can't work toward change, but it's about embracing, in so many words, with curiosity and kindness, what's happening. It's really about seeing the situation the way it is without our interpretation, really seeing it for the facts that are part of it. And also noticing that we react to the facts, but we're not going to judge that or criticize that. So, to understand the true depth of acceptance, we need to be open to our own inner experience of our thoughts and our feelings, and this is really, again, done by accessing that observer self part of our consciousness, that observer self which can watch and it can witness, but it doesn't feed the drama. It doesn't use the backstory to frame and interpret what's happening.
Well, it seems to me like the mind would pull your, to old reactions.
Well, it absolutely does. The brain doesn't like things that are unfamiliar. And so sometimes when we try new things, it can trigger us. And all of a sudden it's like, oops, I'm in that reactivity and whirling with that. So the process and practice of acceptance is really beginning with that practice that we've talked about and turning toward the discomfort of being in the present moment awareness, really allowing ourselves to experience what is arising, negative as they may be, and letting them be just as they are. We develop a different relationship with them when we allow them to be as they are. And we're not making them right or wrong. Even in the practice, it's about allowing myself to say, well, this is okay. Even if it's uncomfortable, it's okay. It's okay for right now. And this may be counter to the way that we usually operate. I mean, most of us have plenty of conditioning, avoiding and denying and reacting, and sometimes even fueling what's happening to us on the inside. And this is so risky for our physical and our mental health because so often, as I've said before, our body believes everything we think, everything we feel. So by maintaining our reactivity, I'm maintaining my stress level and all the effects of that, all the negative, unhealthy effects of that. So in acceptance, I'm shifting my stance, the way I'm perceiving, from not wanting my thoughts and feelings to being open to them, to being open to whatever is arising. And in doing this, my reactivity is altered. We're creating new neural pathways. We're creating new programming. The brain doesn't give up anything. So that old way of reacting is still there. But in rewiring the brain, we want to reprogram new firing of neurons and create new neural pathways. So we observe our thoughts and feelings with openness and curiosity, kindness, and we move our focus then to sensing what's happening in our bodies. Remember, the body is the vessel of our awareness, and feeling into the body, allowing the unpleasantness to move. And this is key because when I'm stuffing it, I'm not allowing it to move. But by moving, we're moving out of this cognitive thinking conceptual realm and we're moving into another way of knowing. And this is where we can access intuition, insightfulness. This supports us working with the negative emotions and also through the negative experience, through the unpleasantness.
This is so familiar. It was, especially to me, it was a practice in the mindfulness classes that you taught. And I remember well, watching the thoughts, feeling the feelings, and moving the attention to the body.
Well, yes, it is an absolute pivotal point in the mindfulness training. The practice of present moment awareness, turning toward the negative emotions. The outcome is that we're able to begin to see the themes of our reactivity, but also we're able to see how it's a temporary state. We're able to see and experience the impermanence of our reactivity and sometimes come to understand the influence of our history, our backstory, and how we frame these experiences. And in the long run, we also move to another way of framing it, sometimes as a weather front, just kind of passing through, just kind of watching this negativity or this weather front just passing through.
Yeah, so I'm intentionally staying with the negative as it arises and not judging it, breathing and noticing where and how my body is registering it, correct?
That's right. That's right. We learn to tolerate distressing emotions by allowing them to be just as they are. And doing so, our level of distress is reduced. It almost sounds counterintuitive, but that's the way it really does play out. It's also important to remember that negative emotions, well, actually, any emotions, are a combination of thoughts, feelings, body sensations, urges, and impulses, all playing together. So, the impact of these acceptance practices is that we can address these in a totally different way than we're accustomed to and really increase our sense of well being, decrease anxiety and depression, reduce our reactivity to stressors in our lives. We can't stop the negative thoughts, okay? We can't stop what spontaneously arises, but we can learn to see them as passing events and give them the space to keep moving through.
Dr. Jane, can you please tell me more about the effects of the practice and the process of acceptance and the benefits?
Sure, Anna. There's some research that indicates that this type of meditative practice actually improves what we call executive control. And the executive control is really part of that more sophisticated brain as far as structurally. It is that higher order perceptual ability to pay attention, to access concentration. It has to do with being able to plan and put forth a plan, actually operationalize a plan, taking it from an idea to implementation. It also includes our ability to really gauge ourselves around behavior, what's appropriate behavior or what's called for in a particular situation, and what's not called for, and being able to kind of inhibit that or stop that. So we're able to make better choices. We're able to really improve our self-monitoring, how we're seeing ourselves and what is called for in a situation, and also to self-regulate, along with being able to sustain our attention and concentration, stick with and maintain focus on things that we believe are important, are necessary in the moment. This is important, really important, given that so many of us have been operating on conditioned kind of behavior, things that we learned to do along the way that aren't necessarily helpful, but certainly we learned to do them along the way. Things like the way we ruminate, the way we angst and worry about things. These are all part of how we've put together how we survive, how we live our daily lives. Remember, the brain doesn't give up anything. So if we've learned to do this ruminating and this worry and angst, that's really the superhighways that we're operating on most days. The key is, as we begin to practice this new way of operating, this practice and process of acceptance and being with what is, not feeding and fueling our reactivity, when we revert back to old behaviors, that old angst, that old worry, that old reactivity, we're likely to catch it more quickly and actually be able to exit the pattern with the acceptance practices. So the brain doesn't give up anything. Those old rumination and worry patterns are still there, but we're building new programming. There was also a study that said it showed that these subjects in the study were given a crash course of a 20-minute mindfulness practice, mindful and acceptance practice. And in 20 minutes of this crash course, they were able to demonstrate this greater emotional self-regulation, less reactivity. There was less activity in the amygdala, which is that smoke detector, that alarm in the brain. They had less of the fight or flight survival responses. And it really indicated that the brain, with very little practice, can really begin to kind of move into a different kind of appraisal of emotional situations, and emotional triggers are changed. Initially it's about the reactivity was decreased, and the subjects were able to calm themselves more quickly in a 20-minute crash course, which really kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, wow, 20 minutes. I mean, imagine the impact of a regular practice.
Well, that's right. And with a regular practice, we can improve our self confidence and our self esteem. We feel more capable not only on what we're able to control, on the outside, but also I feel better about myself on the inside.
Yeah, absolutely. That reminds me of the serenity prayer, accept the things I cannot change, change the things I
Oh,
can, and have the wisdom to know the difference.
well, and on it, doesn't that really sum it up? I mean, the inside job is that we step into our experience of non acceptance first. We step into the negative emotions, experience the emotions that I'm embroiled in, and then decide, what do I have control over, and what do I not have control over? And then the beauty of accessing the wisdom to know the difference, is knowing that, as I mentioned earlier, that what arises is that I'm open, I'm non judgmental of what's happening in the moment. So, this mindfulness practice of acceptance is like exercising a muscle. It strengthens with repetition. Um, it has to be appropriate repetition. We have to do it, we have to do it properly. But remember, we're not reviewing what the emotional scenarios are. We're really focused on our reactivity, but we're not wallowing in it. We're really looking at the negatives, but we're not ruminating on them. We're not worrying or feeding our fears and anxiety. Rather, we're observing what's happening spontaneously, what's arising, thoughts, feelings, body sensations, urges, from a neutral position of that observer self. Oh, how about that? Look at that. Look at what's happening right now. This is what it feels like to be angry. I go to my breath. I go to my body and see where my body is holding the reactivity.
Yes, this feels so familiar. It's in such a good way, I have to say, finding the exit off that so-called 8-lane superhighway that you and I talk about, and finding peace and being with what is happening in the moment without fighting it or myself.
Yes. Yes, because we can't control what comes up. Things happen spontaneously. What I'm responsible for is how I deal with what's coming up, what I do next. So we're separating our feelings and our interpretation of our feelings, um, and all that bundle from the activating event. I'm observing what's happening. I'm observing how I'm in my reactivity. I'm not fueling it, but in doing so, I'm reducing my emotional pain because I'm not trying to control what's happening. I'm just allowing it to move through me. And our current situation in the pandemic has triggered the ancient 35,000-year-old wiring that is all about survival, the survival network in our brain. And it's hijacked our thinking brain. So we're embedded now with this fear. And over time, this really creates kind of a negative bias. And many of us are operating out of that negative bias, which really draws us into the worst case scenarios in order to seek safety and security. And it leaves us with this feeling that we're overstimulated, that we're stressed, that we're burned out and depleted. And really, it impairs our ability to find creative problem solving solutions, those win win situations.
Yeah, all of these mindful acceptance practices offer us space between us and what we're having to deal with on a daily basis so life can become more manageable.
Well, that's exactly right. And manageable, not because the situation or the person has changed, but because we've stepped away and withdrawn our investment from our negative interpretation of the situation. The practice is the key. Practice turning toward the discomfort with kindness and curiosity, building the mindful acceptance muscle. And so often our compulsive behaviors are the red flags that I'm not accepting something. Those medicating behaviors of food, the alcohol, the drugs, the media, all of that, shopping, all of that tends to give us the heads up that this is a situation, or there is a situation that we're running from or avoiding. And when we notice these red flags, that's a time to say, stop, turn toward the struggle. What's really going on here? What are the thinking pieces? What am I responding to that I'm reacting to like this? What's really going on? And doing this, holding it with true kindness and compassion, being curious about getting to the bottom of it.
So we're choosing to slow down and welcome the emotions, no matter what they are. It feels radical and in a good way, though, to me.
Well, it's really living life on life's terms, refusing to disconnect from life as I know it, and often these negative emotions that occur are true catalysts for change. I mean, true change that's made through conscious choice, which starts always by ignoring exactly what's going on in the moment.
I think this is a good segue to remind everyone that the technique turning towards the discomfort video can be found on our YouTube series.
Oh, Anna, that's right. And by really jumping into the practices and doing them regularly, this is using the bicycle analogy that I use so often. This is the difference between reading the books or watching the videos of riding a bicycle and actually getting on a bicycle, hands on the handlebars, feet on the pedals, and start pedaling. This is where we're actually able to experience the real impact of this practice of acceptance and the change it can make in our lives.
Well, it certainly is, Dr. Jane. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation today. Until
Thank
our
you,
next
Anna.
conversation, Dr. Jane.
Thank you, Anna.